thanks everybody for being here. We appreciate you coming the big long trek across the driveway to get here. We were lucky to be able to get a suite so close to the convention center. This next hour is really fascinating to me. We've all seen TED, Technology, Education, and Design, is it? And Entertainment. Technology, Entertainment, and Design. You know, the TED Talks. And recently, they switched over to using Final Cut 10. And their workflow is very interesting because of some of the auxiliary things they do that I'm actually very passionate about and very curious. So welcome, Isaac from TED.
My name's Isaac. I'm one of the 4 editors at TED. I'm going to give a quick little background on what TED is and what we do, and then I'll jump into some of our workflow stuff. So TED stands for Technology, Entertainment, and Design, as Chris said. We're a nonprofit organization. We're devoted to ideas worth spreading. These ideas are usually in the form of short, powerful talks or musical performances, which a presenter usually delivers in 18 minutes or less. Whoa. All right. TED began as a conference in 1984, but it wasn't until 2006 that we started to put these talks online. For free, actually. So there's some talk about TED being a really expensive conference and stuff to go to. Those people pay money for everyone else to be able to watch the talks for free. I think that that's really important, that not a lot of people understand. Currently, there are over 2,000 talks that we have posted on TED.com, and we continue to post a new talk every single weekday. So if we do a little math, that's 5 talks a week multiplied by 49 active posting weeks for a total of 245 new talks on TED.com each year. I'm one of 4 staff editors responsible for editing the bulk of these talks from scratch. Each editor is tasked with completing around 3 talks a week, which is a group effort that results in us churning out about 12 to 15 talks every 5 days and around 50 to 60 videos each month. This is all in addition to the various other side projects that we feature and feature videos that we have on some of our other sites, like TED Ed and the TED blog and ideas.ted.com, which is our version of an online magazine. So today, before I get into all the Final Cut 10 stuff, I'm going to provide an in-depth look at the evolution of our workflows, both on-site at the conference, as well as in the edit bays at TED headquarters in New York. I'm going to go over our team's transition from relying heavily on Final Cut 7 for our workflow to utilizing Final Cut 10, along with an overview of the obstacles that we've encountered along the way. And I'm going to warn you, it is going to get a little technical and workflowy at times. But hopefully, if you're anything like me, it'll be fascinating rather than traumatizing. And just remember, you only have to listen to this for about 20 to 30 minutes. We had to deal with it every single day. So I'm going to begin in January of 2013 when I first started working at TED. At that time, the editors were exclusively using Final Cut 7 for all of our projects, which were small, self-contained, organized things. Typically, each project consists of about 8 individual camera angles and 3 board switches, a live mix, a graphics feed, and a web mix, which is the live mix with the graphics overlay. The editors are also given the speaker's keynote or PowerPoint presentation, along with any other extras that may have been used during the performance. Before I started working at TED, I worked as a freelance television editor, and I was accustomed to working on both Avid and Final Cut. I never really got to Premiere. And I was regularly switching between all different sorts of NLEs, which I'm sure a lot of you freelancers are very familiar with. I was also very adept at working in Multicam and pretty much all of my projects. Most editors are familiar with that now, which is awesome. Some of the shows I worked on regularly used multicams that had at least 20 camera angles all the time for the entire run of the show. And most of this was at 15:1 offline RT, low-res codecs and stuff because we had shared storage that we had to work off of. And the TED projects are much simpler because it's 1 project per talk, 4 bins per project, 1 export sequence, minimal deliverables, really easy, no networks to deal with. We just post stuff straight online. And all the footage at our conference is generally shot in 1080p 2398 ProRes 422, and it gets synced, media managed, consolidated before it gets handed off to the editor. And so needless to say, I was really excited to just dive right into cutting TED Talks and just working with a project that I could just start editing in minutes. Except there was a catch, because unlike all of my other projects as a freelancer, TED didn't use Multicam. Instead, they employed a stacked timeline method to edit each talk. So we're looking at projects that when you start, looks like this. And so on top of that, you can see that every video ISO is also had about 8 channels or tracks of audio associated with it. So we're talking 40 tracks of audio and 12 tracks of video just when you start for every single talk. And I'm not going to lie, I was dumbfounded. I did not understand why anyone would choose to edit stuff this way, because it just didn't make sense. But there are actually a number of really good reasons. First and foremost, at TED, we're under strict deadlines, post-production deadlines. We turn stuff around in a day or less a lot of times. So it wasn't feasible to transcode all of this media into offline RT in order to edit in Multicam and then online everything before we delivered stuff again. It just wasn't in our workflow. We were also dealing with a lot of hardware and bandwidth limitations. Most of the drives that we had in the office had FireWire 800 or Thunderbolt ports, but even the ones with Thunderbolt ports were really like battle-worn and unreliable. So just the thought of trying to edit a 12-camera full ProRes 422 multicam in Final Cut 7 or really any other NLE for that matter, my iMac would just beach ball just thinking about that. So here we were, destined to edit these talks in a very slow and archaic process. But as a side note, like I said, coming from the world of freelance reality television, where I was forced to really plow through all of my edits all the time really fast to create a rough cut that was fully scored and polished, for the network in a matter of a week or so, for a couple of weeks for like an hour-long show. The stack track method employed at TED really forced me to slow down. I became very deliberate with my edits because I literally had no choice. I had to disable and enable every edit track at every edit point to select my next video angle. It was really annoying. It was very tedious. It was time-consuming. Before I started working at TED, I thought that I could easily knock out a talk a day, 3 to 5 a week. It'd be simple. Instead, I found myself struggling to get through 3 talks a week. The constant stop and start of this entire process made it impossible to really get into a speaker's rhythm and flow and to really make them be the best that they wanted to be as a presenter, which is what we try to do as editors at TED. There was also all the audio that had to be dealt with and cut down. Most of it was redundant, safety tracks for safety tracks. And I understand why the production team did this, because they'd been burned in the past due to power outages or hardware failures. So I really understood the overabundance of caution. But no one enjoyed combing through the long audio maps for each of these conferences to find the presenter mic, the ambient mic, the program mix, etc. Or the amount of work that it took to add and adjust audio keyframes for a lot of these. I'm sure you guys are familiar with audio editing in Final Cut 7. I probably spent more time adjusting my audio than I did actually doing my video edits. It just really sufficiently lacked. It made us the overall method. It was technically effective, but it really lacked the flexibility that we craved as editors, because it burdened us with repetitive actions instead of allowing our creative energy to flow. So before I get into how we ironed out the majority of these issues, I want to explain our legacy workflow with Final Cut 7 that we employed at the conferences. And trust me, it's all gonna pay off in the end. So TED 2013, which happened about 2.5 months after I started working at TED, was a really big learning experience for me, because it was the first time I got to see our workflow in action. Honestly, it blew my mind. This is Long Beach TED 2013. The sheer amount of data that we processed on a daily basis, the ridiculous number of Pegasus R6 drive arrays that we had shipped across the country in Pelican cases, the vast amount of Apple displays that we had on display throughout the entire media cave, it was astonishing. But all of this also meant that we had to be prepared for every worst case scenario. Because at some point, somewhere in this impressively powerful and expensive chain of hardware, something was going to fail. I mean, it was just statistically inevitable. And TED only holds a couple of conferences each year. So these events provide us with our bread and butter, the bulk of the footage that we edit for the entire year. We simply just couldn't afford to lose any of this footage. So we had contingency plans. We had backups of backups of backups. We had parallel systems running at the same time. And since it's a lot to take in, I just want to give you a few details of the basic overall layout of a TED conference and the type of stuff that we would have to deal with as editors. A TED conference is 5 days long. Each day typically has 3 sessions. A session usually has 5 to 7 talks. Each session is usually about an hour and a half to 2 hours long. We had 9 cameras plus the 3 broadcast mixes that I mentioned earlier. This was all recorded onto 12 KeyPro decks, and we also had a backup set of KeyPro decks that we used for safety in case something happened to one of our original files. And at the time, we employed the powerful use of SneakerNet. Do you guys know what SneakerNet is? To transfer these drives from the truck to the media cave, which was usually about 3 floors away on the completely opposite side of the convention center. So just in case anybody here isn't familiar with SneakerNet, I'm going to explain it to you really quickly. Immediately after a session ends, a runner heads to the broadcast truck to collect both sets of those KeyPro drives from the record decks. The runner would then bring those drives to the media cave using their sneakers by running them with each KeyPro, where each KeyPro was hooked up to one of our discrete copy stations. And those copy stations were made up of a Mac Mini, a Thunderbolt display, and one of those pegs. So each copy station was designated specifically to 2 cameras throughout the entirety of the conference. The media from each individual KeyPro was checked to make sure that it passed our QC test before we downloaded it. So that meant making sure that all the QuickTime files across all KeyPros were the same file size, the same length, making sure that they opened up in QuickTime, making sure that they all had the audio that we needed for each camera angle, and so on and so on. And then once all the files passed this QC, our full session QuickTimes were then downloaded off the KeyPro drives onto a peg that was assigned to that copy station for each individual camera angle. Then we took those files that we downloaded and backed them all up onto one discrete peg just for safety, for redundancy's sake. And then once all this copy process was done, then we could actually start media managing. So all 9 isolated camera feeds, as well as the 3 broadcast mixes, were imported into Final Cut 7 and stacked on top of each other in a timeline. We adjusted the sync across all camera angles using a mix of timecode and markers to set our in and out points. And then once we had those in and out points set, we went to the first presenter's talk in the session. We used the blade all command at each of the in and out points to permanently denote the beginning and end of each individual's talk. And then we continued to do this throughout the entire session over the course of the 1.5, 2 hour long project files, marking the beginning and end of each presenter with that blade all. Once we finished all of this and we had each individual talk in the timeline separated like this, we started a consolidation process. So we did this so that we could get 12 discrete QuickTime files that were only associated with each individual speaker. Otherwise, trying to transfer all this media back and forth would just take way too long. So all told, this process of media management, from the moment that we received the KeyPro drives in the media cave to handing off the media to an on-site editor, would take roughly 4 to 5 hours, minimum. And the majority of that time was just spent waiting for Final Cut 7 to render out the individually consolidated QuickTime files across an entire session. 3 hours, like minimum, to just sit and wait. So once again, we found ourselves in a situation where we were technically effective, but we had a really slightly inefficient workflow. I mean, slightly inefficient is being generous, for a number of reasons. And the first obstacle that we had to deal with was time. Because during the conference, we routinely post talks to TED.com the day after they're recorded on the stage. However, the extreme length of time that we were forced to wait for our media management process often resulted in editors not receiving footage until really late at night, which required overnight edits, and those are not fun. This is without any hiccups in the process. So if we had a dead keypro drive or one of our files was corrupt, it really wreaked havoc on our workflow. So we had all these hours of inactivity sandwiched between bursts of intense action. For instance, the keypro drives had to be, once everything was QC'd and downloaded, those drives had to be immediately returned backstage so that they could be wiped and ready to record the next session. So usually we had an hour or less to QC all of this stuff. And then we'd have to rush to get stuff media managed so that we could sit and wait for stuff to be consolidated. So by the time the editor actually sat down to sift through all of these videos and audio tracks stacked on top of each other in the timeline, we'd been waiting for 5 hours at least to get this stuff going. So there was really barely any time left to edit, polish, mix, and do everything else that we needed to do to export the talk and deliver it so that it could post the next morning. And we did this every single day, over and over again, for 12 sessions, over the course of 5 days. So we easily spent over 60 hours or 2.5 days simply waiting for our computers to do stuff for us. It's just not efficient. But it's the best that we had at the time. So that brings me to the second obstacle that we had to deal with, and that's hardware and bandwidth limitations. Now, these file sizes were pretty massive. Because each full session camera angle could run upwards of 150 gigs to 2 hours, multiply that by 12 camera feeds, and you're looking at 1.8 terabytes of data per session. And then by the end of the conference, we'd easily have 21.5 terabytes of data. So not only did we have to media manage all that stuff on site, we also had to back it up. And like I said before, to be extra safe, we made backups of those backups, because our backups were being put onto pegs that were going to be then loaded into Pelican cases at the end of the week and shipped across the country. So who knows what's going to happen in that process. So we really just couldn't take any chances. So in order to offset that, we also utilized offsite data centers to transfer all 21 terabytes of media at the end of the week, or throughout the week, to our office, so that by the end of the week, when we all got back to New York, we'd have something to work with. There are lots of other little simple, smaller things that we had to deal with, all of which relied heavily on the media management process. I'm not going to go into all of them. I would like to point out one example, which is our creation of screeners for each individual speaker at the conference. We generated these using the consolidated web mix that I talked about earlier. And we'd add a watermark to them. We'd make an H.264. We'd put it on a thumb drive and give it to a speaker at the conference so that they would have something to look at and give us notes on their talk when it finally came time to edit their talks. The biggest problem with this workflow, which I haven't mentioned yet, is that it's one that could easily be overlooked, and that's the complete lack of a relationship that we had between our original full session files and the consolidated media that we had. They didn't relate to each other anymore once we consolidated them. So we're talking about not only the fact that we need to back up those full session ISOs, we also had to back up all of our consolidated media. Otherwise, things wouldn't relink when we had to go back into the project months or years later. So you've got all these full session ISOs and all this consolidated media. It's completely unrelated, just taking up space on our storage systems, which was just really, really redundant. So this really started to cause some friction within the office across our entire company, because not only do we store media on these servers, we also store photos and lots of other things. So a few months after TED 2013, in June, we produced our second conference that year, TED Global. And once again, we did the same workflow and we chugged along, but we did make one significant change, which I found very, very helpful in the edit bay. And I'm sorry about the Final Cut 10 image, only because we weren't on Final Cut 10 yet, but I just didn't have a project file to find to highlight this. We decided to revise our workflow so that we actually included an audio pass before we gave the talks to the editors. So that vastly reduced the amount of audio tracks that we had to go through. So we would give this stuff to a mixer in New York. He would give us back 5 stems, usually a mix, the speaker, an ambient mix, an ambient premix, so without any effects on it, and music or whatever else we might have to add to that. And so on site, we still had to use all of those audio tracks because we had such a tight turnaround. But once we got back to the office, we didn't have to deal with that anymore. And it was right around this time after TED Global that we really started to talk about upgrading from Final Cut 7 because it was legacy. We didn't know how much longer it was going to be supported. And our former director of film and video, Michael Glass, was starting to talk about shooting TED Talks in 4K. And the possibility of shooting stuff in 4K really helped us foster the conversation about how we needed to improve our workflow. But because Final Cut 7 would never support 4K, we really had to move on. So we started talking about Final Cut 10. A number of us in the office had already used it before for projects at TED and individually, and we really liked a lot of the new features. It was, I think, still version 10.08 at the time, but we kind of felt that it wasn't ready for our workflow in particular. Michael brought in Jem Schofield, who's a great guy, and he kind of walked us through the process. And it was really fun. We as the editors, we all brought in all of our systems, our desktop systems, into a conference room. We set up stuff in a circle. We went over multicam editing. We went over audio editing and trying to, like, I don't know, I can't remember if we could embed audio at that time in multicams. But we found that for us, it was still a little clunky. I mean, there's the learning curve that you got to get over when you start with Final Cut 10. But even once you get past some of that, some of it just didn't seem to fit into our workflow. At least not yet, because we didn't walk away from that completely empty-handed. We started talking, well, first of all, we loved being able to finally edit in multicam because, I mean, honestly, if you're doing stuff like this, you need to have multicam. You need to have this director's view to be able to edit stuff efficiently. And there were other things that we loved about it. We loved the prospect of using FCPXML for a number of things. And the metadata stuff, we were really starting to get jazzed about. So as we began to start pondering the possibilities that some of these things that Final Cut 10 could unlock for us, I decided I'm just going to take this peg that I was just training with in the conference room and move it to my system in my edit bay, and I'm just going to start editing talks in Final Cut 7 in multicam, because there's no way in hell that I'm going back to that stack track method. I want to do multicam. So we continued to explore other options while we were testing stuff out. We went to Josh Apner's facility, Manhattan Edit Workshop in Manhattan, and we went over some Premiere stuff there. And we liked Premiere. I mean, it had a lot of the functionality that we wanted, and Premiere guys are probably going to get mad if I say it was basically like Final Cut 8 to us. So I think that's, some of our editors really latched onto that to begin with. But I personally hated the audio editing in Premiere. I couldn't get my head wrapped around it. And I really loved the way that Final Cut 10 allowed us to do audio editing by the range selection and then just dropping down. I mean, that was just magic to me. So I immediately crossed Premiere off my list. I feel like I have to mention Avid just to mention Avid, but after looking at Final Cut 10 and even Premiere, it just didn't excite us. For what we were doing, it's just way too much for us. So now we're in January of 2014. It's a few months before our next big conference, and I personally made the executive decision that I'm just going to start being the guinea pig in the office for Final Cut 10, because at that point, 10.1 had come out. It fixed a lot of our multicam problems that we had, or at least that we thought we had at the time. So I just really wanted to, kick the tires a little bit. And also, I got some new hardware that I really wanted to test out. So what better way to test it out than with Final Cut 10 and multicam? So by the time we got to TED 2014, a few months later, I felt really comfortable with the program, at least for our workflow and what we were doing. I was slated to edit a number of really high-profile talks and other little videos on site. And I'm a firm believer in just total immersion education, just like getting yourself in there and not going back to Final Cut 7 and switching back and forth, because it just makes the process of learning Final Cut 10 so much harder. So just, if you haven't made the switch to Final Cut 10 yet, you're probably not in this room, but just go with it. Just drop in and do it, and try not to look back at Final Cut 7 for a while. So I just viewed this as a really golden opportunity to just really go whole hog on Final Cut 10. And I found that for the most part, I was flying through my edits. It was really fun, too. I just really had an awesome time editing in Final Cut 10. Now, that's not to say that it was all sunshine and rainbows. There are a lot of issues that I had, and I probably blurted out a couple of curse words pretty loudly in the media cave. And also in the months that followed as we continued to learn stuff. But I still really, really loved it. And I loved editing in Multicam. And so once we got back after the conference to New York, I just continued to exclusively work in Final Cut 10 and try to hone my skills. Maybe pave a path for the other editors so that if they start having questions and concerns, I can help guide them through some of the really tricky things that it takes when you first start learning Final Cut 10. So here I am back in my office working. And we continued to look at some other stuff. I think at this point we really narrowed it down to Premiere and Final Cut 10, and we were really leaning heavily at Final Cut 10. Our tech team at the same time had started to do a massive overhaul of a lot of our company's end-to-end process for ingesting and organizing and archiving all 30 years of our conference media. So we had another conference coming up really, really soon. The pressure was on to really get all these systems in place. They wanted to utilize a lot of Final Cut 10's robust metadata features and stuff. So I think that the hardest thing for my team of editors as I continue to work in Final Cut 10 and show them stuff, they were getting more and more intrigued with some of the stuff that I was able to do and how fast I was able to turn stuff around. But we had a lot of debates, and we still have a lot of debates, honestly, about some of the pros and cons of this particular software for our particular workflow. And just because as editors, we strongly felt that the most important aspect of making this switch was the ability to choose a tool that worked for us and not against us. And I think that learning curve of Final Cut 10 makes it seem like it's working against you. Once you're able to unlock the possibilities and potential of the program, it really works for you. So the tech team kept working on stuff to harness the power of Final Cut 10's metadata and XML features. Other members of the production team started jumping on board and getting really excited about stuff. They were looking at ways to utilize Final Cut 10 in our process. The editors we were all relying on online tutorials and other training stuff to really just anytime we had a question, we could just dive right in, figure something out, and just keep moving forward. At least that's what I was doing. I'm pretty sure that that's what they were doing too. But we really decided that Final Cut 10 it's a viable option for us. Once we ironed out a lot of our kinks and stuff, it was like, you know what? We can do this. So let's just set a deadline. Let's just do it. We're going to set a deadline. It's September 1st, 2014, 1 month before our next big conference. So by this time, all the editors, every new project that we open, we're in Final Cut 10, and that's it. And it was really right around this time that Sam came on to help us, and Noah and FCPWORKS. And I gotta thank Sam, honestly, because without his help, we never would have achieved this goal. Sam came to New York for a week. He spent a lot of one-on-one time with us. We had a lot of group powwows, and then we would break off and go over stuff. And we would just cycle through things throughout the week. And since we were all in various states of efficiency and comfort with the program, Sam really allowed us, he really just allowed us to guide our own training. So he would sit back, let us explain our frustrations, and then just try to help us figure stuff out. He never dictated well, you're doing it wrong, this is the way you need to do it. He allowed us to explore and really get our hands on the program in a very comfortable way, which I think is really the only way that we went from just accepting the program to really embracing it. So now the question on our team became, how do we harness all of the power of Final Cut 10? What if we could find a way to improve the ingestion and media management process for all of our future conferences and also make things just a lot quicker and faster once we get back to New York in our edit bays? How do we reduce the storage space on our DAM at the same time? So our tech team had been working on this for years, but they finally rolled out this beautiful piece of hardware that we call the Hoover. Now, and it's beautiful. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, because once I start telling you what this thing does, you'll believe it's beautiful too. The Hoover is our on-site DAM, our data asset management tool. It's a simple box. It runs on Linux. It's fantastic. And we got the name because, one, it operates not only as our mobile DAM at the conference, but we also used it to ingest all of our media as we recorded talks, sucking it up like a vacuum. So how does it work? Well, I'm going to show a quick little video, and some of this stuff might not make sense right away, but you'll see the transition or the evolution of our workflow in this video, how we still had to employ SneakerNet, but we were also doing some other stuff that really allowed us to make things go a little bit faster. Saved us, as you can see, like a boatload of time. And I really should say that this was the first iteration that we used this combination of custom hardware and software. So we had some kinks. It doesn't look as pretty as we might want it to look, but like I said, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, because I didn't have to do overnight edits after that. Like, I was able to I'd get my media and I could start working on stuff. So how does Final Cut 10 fit into this? Well, to be completely honest, it's sort of a touchy subject at our office right now, where we're trying to figure some stuff out. The original idea was that we would take Final Cut XML information and use that to replace the blade all consolidation process that we used to do before. Excuse me. So our improved workflow was we would import the media into Final Cut 10. We'd make a multicam. We'd set keyword ranges to denote each specific speaker. Then we would export a session XML, import that XML into Hoover, and then we would generate the consolidated media for each individual speaker based on that metadata. And it didn't quite work the way that we wanted it to, but of note, and I'll get to why in a second. Of particular note here is that we decided to kind of knock keypros to the back of our ingest process. Before, they were always in the front and at the back. Now they were simply in the back. And what we decided to do was utilize Blackmagic's HyperDeck Studio and Studio Pro decks, because we were able to record stuff on SSD. It was just a lot faster for us. So they recorded all of our media. We ran into a hiccup, though, where we couldn't reduce the number of audio tracks per ISO. So every single ISO was coming in with 16 tracks of audio, as opposed to the 8 that we had, and across 12 camera angles and all of our broadcast mixes for an entire 1.5-hour session. So you can imagine trying to make a multicam in Final Cut 10 with that much information. At the time, given the waveform rendering issues and the background stuff that we, even though we would manually try to turn it off, it kept chugging along, it completely stopped us. We just couldn't use that workflow. It's very angelic, I know. So we had to try to find some workarounds. And that's not to say that Blackmagic stuff doesn't work or that Final Cut 10 was a major issue or that they don't work together. But in our real world case scenario at that time, on a beach in Brazil with the language barrier and all sorts of other stuff, it didn't work for us. So we had to try to learn from this experience and get some takeaways. We had our next big conference in Vancouver only 4 months later, so we didn't have a whole lot of time to do a lot of new real-world testing, but we did make some improvements to our workflow that worked for us. First, we swapped out the HyperDex and we brought in Synodex. Synodex gave us the opportunity to utilize network record technologies so we could completely bypass our drive-based ingest system. So say goodbye to SneakerNet and hello to the future. We could monitor through the Hoover all the media that was being recorded into the Synodex in real time. And the Hoover was 3 floors away and connected to a giggy pipe that we had backstage. And we were recording that stuff at like 1.2, 1.3 gigs a second. And while we were simultaneously recording, we were also able to transfer chunks of media back to our New York office. So this was pretty phenomenal for us to be able to do this. And also, just in case of total network failure, because I understand that that's a major pressure point, we also utilized the SSD cards inside the Synodex. So we had network as our proprietary, we had the SSDs as our backup, and then we also had KeyPros as our third offline backup that was completely outside of the Hoover workflow, just in case something crazy happened with the Synodex. So our tech team raced to also build a bare bone proprietary software to manually record in and out points while we were recording stuff, just because we didn't have time to really dive into and troubleshoot the issues that we were having on site with Final Cut 10 and the XML process that we originally wanted. And maybe that's not the way that the XML data is supposed to be utilized. That's what we were trying to do. So we built this proprietary software to record these ins and outs on the fly during the record. And I'm going to say that for the record, we're not giving up on Final Cut XML. It might not fit into our workflow at the conference just yet, but we are utilizing it in different ways. For instance, we're trying to test right now the effectiveness of title recreation on edited talks while we are encoding them. So that means adding titles while it's being compressed to be put online on our websites. And we can do this by parsing readable information from FCPXML data and generate these lower thirds that replicate our specific font, length, and overall style for our titles, right down to the softness of the drop shadows that we use. So this would undoubtedly give us tremendous flexibility in the future should we ever decide to change our font style, for example, or to correct a spelling error. Any other simple change that would otherwise require tracking down the library and relinking everything and re-exporting and going through all that stuff. We're already implementing a version of this idea with our speaker screeners that I mentioned earlier, and how we give those to, how we generate the watermarks and stuff before we give those to the speakers on site. So it's a lot of stuff, and I understand that you guys probably have a lot of questions. There's a lot of stuff that we want to get to, and I saved some of the Final Cut 10 specific stuff, so when I'm talking with Sam and Chris, we can do this. 2 seconds. So I'm just gonna. This is just a quick recap of all the things that we've upgraded over the last 2 years. My favorite is that we no longer have overnight edits. We are still using Final Cut 10 a lot. As editors, this proxy workflow has totally changed the way that we edit. We can edit in Multicam now, and it's fantastic. Like I mentioned before, the audio adjustments are so much faster and so much cleaner and so much easier. And our library archives are beautiful. I've never seen more beautifully archived libraries in my life. And I just want to share one more case study that I love, and I think it really highlights the we're just at the infancy of Final Cut 10 at our company and utilizing Final Cut 10 stuff with our Hoover. But I think that this just really highlights to me like the strength of what we can do and where we're going to go, and the potential that we have. So we had a really high-profile speaker who gave a very transformative talk near the end of our conference, and it was slated for immediate turnaround on site. I was given the opportunity to edit it, as well as prepare a short clip for all sorts of media outlets that we could give to the media so that they could post it ahead of our scheduled posting time the next morning. With our any other iteration of our workflow, it would have taken hours after the session ended to deliver this clip to the media, just a really long time. But instead, we were able to extract portions of the footage across all camera angles while the talk was being recorded, and then transfer that stuff to a drive that I was able to then cut, edit, and hand off to my colleague Eric to encode to give to our media outlets before she even walked off the stage. I mean, that to me is just amazing. Not only that, but I was able to start editing that talk. The 5 to 8 hours that it would have taken before I even got the footage, I was already on my second pass. And at that same time, we sent back a bunch of Pro Tools stuff to New York. We had those audio stems made. I got those audio stems back the next morning, and I just dropped it into my Multicam after it was completely edited, and all those audio edits just cycled through, and I was able to just very cleanly export it. There's just no way that you could ever, I don't know of any other program that allow you to do that. Like, that's just amazing. So yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks, and I'd like to bring up my colleague, Eric. We're out of time.
We're out of time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. TED Talks are 20 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Just because I work at TED doesn't mean that I know how to give TED Talks. I know how to edit them. I know how to edit them.
Your story was clinched with the slide in Final Cut 7 with all the layers. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that I used to edit simple things, not 12 different feeds the same way, and I talked myself into thinking this was better for one reason or another.
As we all do, because you get used to just doing repetitive actions and motions. And
but the multicam, as powerful as it is, I think one of the things that's the most interesting about what you guys do is the way you track the XML title data through, and that stuff is generated on your encode, correct? Are you still doing that?
We're trying to do that. It's fits and starts.
Okay.
We had back-to-back conferences, so it was just really just making sure that we were prepared for the next conference.
Right.
Now we've got a little bit more time that we can really dive into.
But this is a hyper-condensed version of where, quite frankly, the entire industry is going. I had a great talk with somebody last night at the FCP dinner, and the idea of profitability and I know you guys are nonprofit, whatever that means, but the idea of profitability in the 21st century has as much to do with efficiency as it does in, controlling costs. Because as we can do more and more, and you're doing so much, like you said, you got your V&R cut before the woman was off the stage. Mm-hmm. Boom,
yeah,
mind blown. Right. And so to be able to do things like that it's again, I know I say this a lot, but Final Cut 10 solves problems for editors that they don't even know they have yet.
Yeah.